Hello, Joe Simhart here. It's May 7th, 2022. This topic today is about Mars myths and Musk, Elon Musk. I just finished this book a little while ago by Philip K. Dick, The Simulacra, and a fascinating book written in 1964, kind of a schizophrenic, brilliantly written schizophrenic look at post-World War III planet Earth and the conditions on Earth around the year 2050 in his imagination. One of the features in this novel, The Simulacra, is that people on Earth can somehow take these things called jalopies, which are one-way trips to Mars, to emigrate, to get away from the oppressive authoritarian governments that exist at that time. And, there's the Soviet Union, there's the Chinese communists, and then there's this oppressive authoritarian government in the Western nations, combining German and the Western area of Europe and the Americas. So, yeah, this was a great book to read. I really enjoyed it. There's a lot of stuff in it that's kind of prescient. For 1964, for instance, there's these self-driving taxis that you can take in places all over the U.S. And there's these kind of communication devices where you can see people, like our video phones today. And Dick was almost a prophet in the way he wrote about human technology and advances in society. But anyway, I had fun reading it. It's a fascinating book. But it got me thinking about this idea of people wanting to go to other planets, to go to Mars. Of course, we've been traveling in our imaginations for quite a while through Star Trek and that kind of thing to other planets where there are civilizations that somehow look a little bit like us or humanoid animal creatures. But there have been a lot of other attempts to take us to Mars in some way. For instance, Edgar Rice Burroughs, the famous author of the Tarzan series, wrote a series about John Carter on Mars. And he first released that around 1911, and it was about this Virginia soldier that had this flash of light experience and got transported to Martian culture. And thus his adventures begin. The idea that there's life on Mars somehow was influenced by a faulty telescope that someone used to look at the planet. And they saw these canals on Mars, well over 100 years ago. And it led to this speculation that there's civilization there that uses canals in order to navigate and farm and whatever. Some of the occultists back in the day, for instance, Rudolf Steiner, this guy, he died in 1925. He was a theosophist, and he broke with theosophy around 1913 and started the Anthroposophical Society based on his ideas. However, back in 1912, about a year after the John Carter series started, Steiner in Munich lectured about the mission of Christian Rosenkreuz. Of course, Christian Rosenkreuz is the founder of the Rosicrucians, and Christian Rosenkreuz is an imaginary being, but Steiner and others lectured as if he was a real person, kind of an ascended, wise adept that guided mankind. Christian Rosenkreuz, in this lecture, again in 1912, it's number 7. It's called The Mission of Gautama Buddha on Mars. So the Christ, Christian Rosenkreuz, sends Buddha on a mission to Mars to educate and energize the planet, and therefore the planet now is connected to Earth, and we can somehow communicate with that planet through what Steiner called supersensible features in our psyche. Anyway, one of the writers that I've admired James Webb, called Steiner schizophrenic. Again, very brilliant schizophrenic, but nevertheless writing about a world that doesn't exist, that only exists in his own mind, which is typical of what schizophrenics do. Another effort to get to Mars was done by the Biosphereans back in around the early 90s, 1990 era. The Biosphere project, I have a brochure here. I went to visit it the day before they launched, supposedly 8 Biospherians that were going to live in this giant greenhouse in Arizona that was allegedly hermetically sealed with ecosystems in it. It was acres big, funded in large part by Ed Bass Jr., who was a member of the cult run by Johnny Dolphin Allen. And here's a picture of Johnny Allen. Now, Allen was into the Gurdjieff teachings early on back in the 70s. And he began a series of cult-like ventures, one which ended up in New Mexico, south of Santa Fe, which I visited. It was called the Synergia Ranch. And it was on that ranch that Allen and his Synergians began to develop this idea of creating an experiment where people could live in it, a kind of a biosphere, big greenhouse. And that would be a first step to us preparing to live on Mars. So the idea was to get onto Mars, was the whole biosphere experiment. It went for about 2 years. It was basically a failure. It was sabotaged by the members themselves because oxygen was running out inside the biosphere. It wasn't designed very well, and they put these scrubbers into it by secretly and to bring oxygen in. So the whole thing was a failure as far as anything that might exist on Mars. The Village Voice and other articles came out. This one in 1991 by Mark Cooper, who was one of the most vocal critics of it, and it's called Bursting the Biosphere Bubble. How occults signed on Yale, the Royal Botanical Gardens, the Smithsonian, and the New York Times. And inside it says, take this terrarium and shove it. The media loves it. Yale loves it. Phil Donahue thinks it's neat. The Smithsonian lends its name. Scientists take its money. So what if the Biosphere 2 is really run by a wacko cult? Don't you want to go to Mars? Yeah, so there's this Martian thing again. So what fascinated me about the story of Dick and John Carter going somehow magically to Mars with the Edgar Rice Burroughs books, and then Steiner and his occult vision of going to Mars is that we have this fascination of, one, escaping from this planet somehow or getting off it because it's getting decrepit or it's being dominated after World War III by authoritarian governments, and Mars is the only escape. But we have Elon Musk, who about 15 years ago began a project called SpaceX, and he was a CEO, and he really thinks that we can do this, that we can set up a culture on Mars. It says here in this article, Musk plans to build a full-size city on the surface of Mars. This would be a city open to regular people, not just scientists and researchers. And it also means regular animals. In other words, he would ship our culture to some extent and become Martians. He expects this to get started by, within his lifetime. So in the next 20 years. Well, good luck with that. We've seen how long it's taken us to get a colony on the moon. We don't have one. So it's an interesting dream by an interesting dreamer, Elon Musk. He's gotten wealthy dreaming about things, and he's been quite successful in his businesses, obviously. The cult I was in, the Church Universal and Triumphant, had a spin on Mars too, but it was not so much that we would visit Mars and that there were Martians, but that Mars has a special energy that can affect us, and we can learn what that is through a kind of astrology. Elizabeth Prophet gave this lecture in 1990, shortly before the cult, about a couple thousand of them, went underground thinking the world was going to end, into a giant underground bomb shelter, one in Montana and several in other places like Idaho. Of course, they came out the next day, the world had not changed, and the bomb shelters they had invested millions in are rotting away, kind of like the giant Biosphere in Arizona. It's being used by some people for some science experiments, but it's essentially just a giant greenhouse. It's no longer a biosphere. Elizabeth Prophet tells us that Mars is linked up with these energies called the four quadrants, four planets, and the four horsemen of the apocalypse. So now we have biblical prophecy aligned with occultism and astrology, and she says that, and here's her chart, by the way, of the four quadrants. She says that the red horse Mars is its feature is the warfare of the soul, warfare against the mother and the divine man-child. So in other words, kind of a negative energy that's out there, a demon that's trying to prevent the birth of the Christ, or the Christ in us, if you want to look at it that way. So I just wanted to take this little tour of Mars through the occult, through mythology, and Philip K. Dick and Rudolf Steiner and Elon Musk. It's interesting reading about how this planet has influenced us and influences our dreams. It's kind of a symbol of, I think what Philip K. Dick does, it's a symbol of our need to escape from what we see as a fallen, decrepit planet and to get a new start somewhere else. Much like we have throughout history, you know, the Europeans coming to the New World, coming into a new age, and of course, ending up conquering the Aboriginal tribes, causing havoc in that way, changing the culture to suit their own. And for better or for worse, here we are on planet Earth. And I don't think things would be much better on Mars if we got there with our squabbles and our differences and all of that. So with that, I'll leave this little jaunt into Martian territory. Thank you for listening.